Hi, third graders. We are here today with Pax. I'm going to be reading chapters 19 and 20. Bristle had started out after Pax, but his long bounds had outpaced hers, and he had run hard all through the night, all through the morning. He had not sensed her presence for hours when he reached the river in front of the mill in the afternoon. He slipped silently into a stand of green reeds downstream from where Gray's body rested. He dipped his head to drink. When his thirst was slaked, he pushed the reeds aside. The field was empty. The vehicles were gone. There was no sign of humans, but their scent were fresh and even sharper than before. They were nearby, and they were very anxious. Pax climbed upstream and crossed the rivers at the narrows, then hurried along the treed ridge to observe the sight from above. New gouges raked across the hillside behind the mill ruins. Like a skulk of foxes taking to its den, the soldiers had retreated to their trenches, a few still digging. Others working on equipment, still others talking together over charts. The vehicles rested behind the walls also. Pax retraced his steps back along the ridge, back across the river, back downstream. Again he slipped into the reeds, and looking up from there, he saw no humans this time either. The dark electric scent hung heavy in the air. The wind eddied, bearing smoke from the west. He'd smell it twice on his way, but now it was thicker, more dangerous, closer. Pax could not wait until the safety of night. He dived into the water and swam with only his sleek head above its surface, climbed the bank, and shook the water from his fur. Keeping low, he headed for the closest cover, a scrub oak skirted with new suckers at its base, just a few full bounds away. From there, he sighted the advantage he needed. Midway down from the mill walls, where the field began to flatten out, a purple granite slab shouldered out from the ground. A bundle of wires trailed over this outcrop before dropping back into the grass. Pax crept out. His paws sensed a threat from the ground. More boxes were buried near the bank. The field crossed with more wires. Leaping clear of the wires, he skimmed the grass so swiftly that they had barely parted. At the base of the slab, he flattened himself and perked his ears uphill. By the steady rhythms of their voices and tools, he knew that the soldiers had not moved from the trenches. The breeze was still downhill. It would alert him if they approached. He pulled a wire out and began to gnaw at it. Before he'd chew through the sheathing, a fury of teeth attacked him from behind. He hit the rock hard. The wind knocked out of him. He rolled to his feet and saw Bristle leap over him to the crest of the slab. From that height, she held the advantage. The crows say war-sick humans are nearing. This exploding earth, these death wires, leave this for them to find. Pax was larger than Bristle, but he was no match for her determination. Every time he attempted to reclaim his position at the wire, her snapping jaws held him away. He circled the outcrop, climbing closer to the mill than he'd like to come at her from above, but before he could pounce, a movement down the river caught his eye. Bristle noted his alarm, but kept her gaze locked on Pax. The humans have arrived? Pax sensed an eager thrill below the question. No, another fox, I think. Bristle refused to be distracted. No fox from our valley would venture past the territory boundary. Pax rose on the haunches for a clearer view. He saw it again, a narrow copper wedge tipped with white that rose and disappeared, running beside the riverbank along exactly the path he had taken earlier. The same path Bristle must have tracked to find him. At the reeds, another red flash. A small fox splashed into the water, and Pax recognized him. He shrieked a warning. Bristle turned to look then. Runt struggled out of the water beside the scrub oak. Instantly, Bristle sprang up. Seeming to double in size in a single leap, she cleared the ledge and then flew down the slope. No, back, home, back. She flashed through the grasses. The panic in her voice only seemed to spur Runt on. He rose again to get her position and then loped in joyful bounds towards her. Pax pounced on the wire, but he was too late. Just as he stripped off its sheathing, a dark odor of lightning blew through the earth. A jolt of current shattered one of his back teeth. It seared his bottom lip, scorched his throat, and sizzled down his spine. And then a swath of lower field exploded into the sky. Pax was knocked off the ledge, and when he hit solid ground again, tangled in uprooted shrubbery, the broken world went silent. His skull rang in the silence, and he watched shock-still as the storm of hot dirt and rocks and branches and weeds rained down upon him and then wasted itself to a veil of grit. He staggered to his feet and sucked the burned air into his flattened lungs until his head cleared. Then he rose on his haunches to sniff for Runt and Bristle. He tried for them in all directions, but his nose was useless, the fine-scenting nerves numbed by ash and soot. He barked for them, but the ringing in his ears was still the only sound he heard. Pax worked his way out of the pile of brush and shook off the debris. Soldiers streamed down the hill across a smoking patch of field and then plunged into the river. When they had passed, he followed. Each movement sent aftershocks through his bones. Where he had last seen them, he called again for Runt and Bristle. There was no answer, but faintly at first, as if they were reaching for his ears from a great distance away, he heard his own barks. And then the sound of the wind and the snapping of seared weed stalks as he crashed through them, and the rough shouts of war-sick men as they returned to the trenches. And from the trees a murder of crows, cawing their displeasure at the ruined world, Pax could hear again. For an hour he paced the field, calling for the missing foxes. Dusk fell before he finally heard it, Bristle's weak answering yelp. He followed to call the river's edge. There the scrub oak was lying splintered and smoking over the bank, its blackened branches in the water. Pax found Bristle tucked into the earthy ball of its roots. Her head was up and her eyes were alert, although her muzzle was matted with blood. The fur of her beautiful brush was burned to a black crust. Pax nosed her face. The blood on her cheeks was not hers. She dropped her head. Curled beneath her was the still body of Runt. Pax dipped his head to the little fox's chest. It rose and fell in ragged hitches, and Pax was relieved. But then Bristle shifted as he saw where Runt's hind legs should have been, where the neat black fur and leg and the quick white paw should have been. There was only a shred red mess of the blood-soaked leaves. This is a sad chapter. Okay, chapter 20. Peter rubbed the chisel handle with oiled steel wool, trying to resist the urge to throw it across the barn. The morning had been good. He crutched over field and woods, through mud and gravel, up hills and down rock faces, over stone walls and under fences. Strong, tireless, and nearly as fast as if he'd had both boots on the ground. At noon, he told Vola he felt ready to go now, and he was, but she had ignored him as usual. She'd ordered him into the barn to rest and taken his crutches hostage. Foot up, polish some tools, get the hand feel of them. His gaze fell on the near-finished carving in front of him on the workbench. The fox was rough, but it looked alive, and it seemed to him a sign that he would find Pax unharmed. Although it felt dangerous to hope, he allowed himself to imagine the scene. He would call for Pax at the spot where he'd left him, and Pax would come bursting out of the woods and probably knock him down in his happiness. They would go home together. "You're going to polish that handle right off, boy." Peter jumped. "I didn't hear you come in." "You can't go drifting off when you're working with tools." Bola settled herself on a barrel beside him and picked up a rasp and an oily cloth. "I was thinking about Pax." He put down the gleaming chisel and picked up his carving. He handed it over when Vola held out a palm. "Looks like he wants to jump out of my hand. You're worried about him?" Peter nodded. "But half the time I think he could be all right. Foxes are smart, really smart. We had to lock the door to the kitchen because Pax could open every cupboard. Once he chewed through the wire to a fan where we just put in my room. My father was really mad, but then, when he was trying to fix it, he found out that the fan had a short in the housing. It would have caught fire. I think Pax knew that somehow, but he was protecting me. So why wouldn't he be smart enough to learn to hunt? Don't you think he could survive? I do, Volo agreed. Peter took the carving back and looked into the fox's face. There's something else, he said. It's that I would know if he died. And then he told Volo what he'd never told anyone else, about the merging he felt sometimes with Pax, how sometimes he didn't just know what his fox was feeling, but actually felt it himself. He held his breath, hearing how crazy it sounded. Instead of laughing, Vola told him he was lucky. You've experienced two, but not two. That's on your board, two, but not two. I didn't know what it meant. It's a Buddhist concept, non-duality. It's about oneness, about how things that seem to be separate are really connected to one another. There are no separations. Vola picked up his fox again. This is not just a piece of wood. This is also the clouds that brought the rain, that watered the tree, and the birds that nested in it, and the squirrels that fed on its nuts. It is also the food my grandparents fed me that made me strong enough to cut the tree, and it's the steel and the axe I used. And it's how you know your fox, which allowed you to carve him yesterday. And it's the story you will tell your children when you give this to them. All of these things are separate, but also one, inseparable. Do you see? Two, but not two, inseparable. So, a couple of nights ago, I was sure that Pax had eaten. I felt it. Last night, I saw the moon, and I knew Pax was seeing it right then, too. Do you think that if I feel Pax living, then he's alive? Yes. Peter's hopes swelled at her words. Vola never said anything she didn't mean. We tell the truth here. That's the rule. She told him that about 100 times. It was a valuable thing, he suddenly realized, to have someone you could count on for honesty. How many times in his life had he wanted only that? How many questions had he needed an honest answer for and gotten instead from his father dark silence? And then before he could chicken out, he asked the one that haunted him. Do you think if someone had a wild part, it could ever be tamed out? If it's in his nature, inherited? Vola looked at him hard. Peter knew she thought he was asking about Pax, but he didn't correct her. He picked up the chisel again and looked down at it on his lap. His fingers squeezed white around the shank as he waited for the answer. You always been like this? Asking other people to figure out your stuff for you, eh? That doesn't work. Peter let out his breath. As soon as he'd asked the question, he'd realized he didn't want to hear the answer. Maybe he would never be ready to hear the answer to that question. Vola patted her overall pocket and frowned. Almost forgot. She pulled out a napkin, wrapped a muffin, and handed it to Peter. He'd eaten 4 of them for breakfast, but she was always convincing him that he wasn't eating enough. He unwrapped it. It was a little squash, but as with the rest of them, the pecans centered perfectly on its brown sugar topping. She'd stayed up late last night baking them, and he had heard her singing something in a language he didn't recognize. Something happy. Vola, why are you still living out here alone? I told you. But 20 years to figure out who you are? I mean, how hard can it be? Plenty hard. The plain truth can be the hardest thing to see when it's about yourself. If you don't want to know the truth, you'll do anything to disguise it. Peter put the muffin down. She was avoiding his question. But you do. You know yourself. So how come you don't go live somewhere with people? Tell me the truth. That's the rule around here, right? She looked out the barn window for a minute. Her shoulders slumped, and when she turned to him, she looked tired. Fair enough, no bet, Peter. Maybe it's because I do know myself. Maybe what I know is that I don't belong with people. Maybe I am a grenade. What do you mean a grenade? What would you call someone who can go from a girl eating peaches and watching fireflies to a woman who kills a man? That girl would have cut off her arm before she'd have hurt a single one of those fireflies. But a few years later, she killed a perfect stranger. I'd call that person a weapon. I'm an unpredictable, deadly weapon. It's best I stay hidden here, where no one will ever be hurt by me, even by accident. She raised her finger and popped them at him. Boom! But this time the gesture looked sad, not menacing. You don't hurt me, Peter answered. How do you know I won't? Because I know. He thumbed his chest. In my core. Lola slapped her palms on the workbench and pushed herself off. Put those tools back in the right order, she muttered over her shoulder as she left. From the window, Peter watched her stamp down the path. It seemed she was moving differently, as if that heart pine leg of hers had grown even heavier. One by one, Peter slid the clean tools into their pockets and then rolled the canvas. He felt his old anxiety coiling at the base of his skull. Over a week, he'd been stuck here. He wouldn't have left already if it hadn't been for the third condition. He promised, and he owed it to Vola, but when he asked her at breakfast about building the stage, she'd only shrugged. I'll get to it. And then the solution hit him, so ridiculously simple that he laughed out loud. Without his crutches, he was awkward and slow again, but he managed to hop outside to where Vola kept a brush pile. There he chose 12 long, straight saplings, each of the thickness of his arm. One by one, he flung them to the barn doorway, then followed and slid them inside. On the sawhorses, he stripped them of the branches, then set to work. And 2 hours later, he had a stage. It wasn't much to look at, the corners raggedly notched and lashed with twine, mismatched scrap boards nailed onto the frame for the walls and the floor. But when he strung a length of burlap over the top, he smiled. Piece of cake, he said to Francis, who wandered in and stopped to sniff the frame in obvious admiration. Piece of cake. I made the stage. It's in the barn. Vola looked up from the chicken she was plucking. She eyed the branch Peter was leaning on and then motioned to his crutches, propped against the kitchen counter. Peter reached for them, slid them under his arms, and felt the immediate comfort they brought. I can do that puppet show for you now. Come to the barn. I have work to do now, but all right, tonight. And then I can leave, Vola. I'm ready. Vola laid the chicken on the table inside. You are not ready. You sleep indoors, dry and warm. You have clean water, and someone cooks your food for you. But all right, tomorrow I will test you. 10 miles. You hike 5 miles, show me you can make a camp on one leg, and hike 5 miles back. Then we'll talk. Peter watched her gather up the chicken feathers and tuck them into a pouch, and it struck him nothing would change after he left. Vola would save her feathers, would make her puppets all alone in the woods, more and more and more of them, and tell that soldier's story to no one. Oh man, this book is getting kind of sad. I hope it's a happy ending. I will be back tomorrow with chapters 21 and 22. I hope you guys have a good night.